1912 is a podcast about the expulsion of more than 1,000 Black residents from Forsyth County, Georgia, and its lasting impact on the families affected. For an episode guide, maps, photos, and more, visit us online at atlantahistorycenter.com. This episode contains strong language and descriptions of violence. Please take care while listening.
All new at 5:30, we are taking a closer look at an all-Black town in Georgia called Oscarville.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about this on social media for the last few
Oscarville
years.
was never a city. It was never a town, anything of the sort.
Everybody has been talking about the haunting of Lake Lanier because of the drowning of Black bodies.
This curse is supposedly tied in with the events which happened in 1912 in the area of Oscarville.
If you haven't heard of it, it's probably because it no longer exists. It's buried under Lake Lanier.
This is kind of like the story that I've been told over the last several years. But I was just like, could we have had it wrong?
I'm Rose Scott, an Atlanta journalist and host with the NPR affiliate WABE.
And I'm Sophia Dodd, a researcher at Atlanta History Center. This is 1912, a podcast from Atlanta History Center Originals, distributed by WABE.
It's 1950. The United States Army Corps of Engineers officially breaks ground to build Beaufort Dam and Lake Lanier. But more recently, rumors that Lake Lanier was built on top of a Black town called Oscarville have gripped audiences. Many believe this is connected to the expulsion of more than 1,000 Black residents from Forsyth County in 1912.
But these two events couldn't be more separate from one another. Oscarville was never a Black town. In fact, it was a mostly white community that was so small, it was described as a post village. By the time Lake Lanier was built in the 50s, Black families had been gone from Forsyth for decades. But Oscarville did play an important role in the expulsion of Black residents in 1912. It's where searchers found the unconscious body of May Crow. Whites in the county accused some of the only Black residents of Oscarville of raping and murdering May. These accusations were the catalyst to expelling the entire Black population.
Around 60 people lived in Oscarville, the vast majority of whom were white. The community was founded in the 1880s when a group of white citizens established their own post office. They named it Oscarville after Oscar Morgan, a white man who was the community's first postmaster. But over a century later, a new version of Oscarville's history has emerged.
Today, the popular idea is that Oscarville was a thriving Black town until 1912. Many believe it was raised and turned into a lake to cover up the killing of Black men accused of raping white women. Some believe they drowned Black residents while filling in Lake Lanier. It goes further, as some even attribute accidental deaths at Lake Lanier to the ghosts of Black residents seeking revenge on lakegoers.
While this myth had been around for years, the story attracted nationwide attention when Amber Ruffin, host of The Amber Ruffin Show, did a segment on Oscarville and Lake Lanier.
This is Lake Lanier, but before it was Lake Lanier, it was a town called Oscarville, Georgia. Now, Oscarville was a thriving, predominantly...
The myth has taken on a life of its own.
Oscarville, unfortunately, was located in one of the most...
being referenced in TV shows, films, and large social media accounts.
Angry mob ensued. The town was burned down.
This myth, however, has real ramifications for descendants of Black families expelled in 1912.
There have been over 700 deaths at Lake Lanier. Over 200 of those
Patrick Phillips, author of Blood at the Root.
Yet for some strange reason,
The story that got going was that Oscarville is under the lake. The dam was created to cover up those crimes. But the distinction that I always try to make is it's true that the crimes of 1912 have been covered up, but the cover is not Lake Lanier. The cover is white suburbia. If the lake covered it all over, there's nothing to do about it. It's gone. It's buried. It's under there. If it's actually buried under your suburban house. You know, if it's buried under your $500,000 house with a pool in the back, you're actually involved, you're implicated.
And those $500,000 homes exist in part because of Lake Lanier. The lake set off decades of property development which changed the face of the county. Forsyth became one of the richest and fastest growing places in the nation. But the lake itself spans across 5 North Georgia counties. So what is the history of Lake Lanier? Well, to understand it, we have to start in Dahlonega, Georgia, 30 miles north of Forsyth County.
Dahlonega is in Lumpkin County, and it's the site of one of the first major gold rushes in the United States. By the early 1900s, it was a popular tourist site for affluent whites driving up from Atlanta, and many of those white tourists employed black chauffeurs. One way to get to Dahlonega was to drive through Forsyth. Leaders in the county knew this. They wanted people traveling through Forsyth to expand their own tourism industry, but the expulsion in 1912 complicated things.
Throughout the 1910s and 20s, white people in Forsyth attacked black drivers over and over as they tried to make their way north to Dahlonega. This started to impact tourism in Lumpkin County. The local newspaper, the Dahlonega Nugget, went so far as to warn tourists to avoid Forsyth. Here's an excerpt from an article dated October 6, 1922.
Now is the most beautiful time for visitors to pay this section a visit. If in Atlanta, they can come the most direct way by coming and reach Dahlonega. If persons have colored drivers, they had better come by Gainesville, as no Negroes are allowed in Forsyth.
The attacks and negative publicity stalled the tourism business Forsyth County officials were eager to attract. By 1924, Forsyth had actually constructed a scenic highway route through the mountains in an effort to develop a tourism economy. But continued reports of attacks against black chauffeurs caused tourism to literally bypass the county.
Which brings us to this. While some may believe Lake Lanier was built to cover up the crimes of 1912, the reality was whites in Forsyth were not hiding the history of the expulsion. Instead, some were enforcing this informal ban on black visitors to the county without being charged for these attacks.
So why does any of this talk about tourism matter? Well, the creation of Lake Lanier in the 1950s fundamentally changed the county. For the first time, Forsyth would have its own recreation site for people to visit. It could be a true tourist destination like Dahlonega. But creating a recreation site was an incidental part of building Buford Dam. The project was led by the United States Army Corps of Engineers as part of a national project to create fresh water and hydroelectric power across the United States.
Those who would benefit most from the dam and lake along the Chattahoochee River were residents of Atlanta, 40 miles south of the proposed site. The mayor of Atlanta, William Hartsfield, lobbied for the creation of Buford Dam and Lake Lanier. It would provide water and hydroelectric power to Georgia's largest city.
Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, why a dam on the Chattahoochee River? The Chattahoochee starts in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia and flows 400 miles south to the Florida Panhandle. The Chattahoochee River current is strong and often volatile. By building a dam in North Georgia, they could better control the current and create electricity.
But blocking off a section of the Chattahoochee River meant water would naturally rise on the other side. This is called a reservoir, also known as a lake. The reservoir would hold billions of gallons of fresh water for Atlantans, and they decided to name it Buford Dam and Lake Sidney Lanier.
Now, notice the name of the dam. It's not the Oscarville Dam, and that's because the dam isn't actually in Forsyth County. The Corps of Engineers decided to build the dam, one county over in Gwinnett, and they named it for the city the dam is in, Buford.
The lake would be in Forsyth County and 4 other North Georgia counties. Lake Lanier is nearly 40,000 acres. The Corps of Engineers had to buy hundreds of properties along the Chattahoochee River in Gwinnett, Hall, Dawson, Lumpkin, and Forsyth.
As you might expect, any time the United States government plans to make someone move, There's going to be pushback, but not so much in Forsyth. The mayor of Cumming, Roy Otwell, enthusiastically supported the project, stating it would create jobs, entice business, and finally, bring tourists and their dollars to the county.
But Forsyth and the other North Georgia counties wouldn't be spending its own dollars to do this. Lake Lanier was a federally funded project. Congress spent $40 million taxpayer dollars to create the dam and lake.
Part of that budget went towards paying property owners to move. In 1949, the Corps warned residents who would be affected by the project they would need to start moving around 1955. So residents in all 5 counties were given 6 years advance notice.
Now, the properties the Corps needed to buy in Forsyth were mostly farmlands that had been passed down in families for generations.
And at this point, Forsyth's population was pretty much all white, so they were the only property owners who were going to be affected by the purchase of land.
There was no bustling black town of Oscarville that would need to be destroyed to make way for the lake.
The lake wasn't built overnight or under any shroud of mystery. People from Forsyth would often visit the worksite just to watch the dam and lake being built. Here's George Perkle from the Historical Society of Cumming, Forsyth County. He was born and raised in Forsyth.
My daddy would take us out every weekend, and we would just watch them down there. And these giant Euclid earth movers would be out there. I remember mud everywhere because it was just, everything was dirt and rocks. There were no towns that were still under there. And I can guarantee you that I never saw, especially down there that close to the dam, I never saw any sign of any structures whatsoever there.
In total, the Corps acquired 56,000 acres of property from Forsyth, Hall, Dawson, Lumpkin, and Gwinnett counties, all to create Lake Lanier. 18,000 of those acres were bought from property owners in Forsyth who were paid at least $1.2 million, all in total.
And the area known as Oscarville is still there. You can go visit. You'll see a road named Oscarville Way, and even the church where May Crow is buried. All of that is still above water.
That's because a black town was not flooded to create Lake Lanier. Black families weren't drowned in the process either. By the time the lake was built, black residents had been gone from Forsyth for decades.
So, Lake Lanier was not built to cover up the crimes of 1912. No white residents were ever arrested for expelling black residents or harassing black visitors until 1980. There was no incentive to cover up anything. Plus, the lake was built in the 1950s, when segregation and racial discrimination were still written into Georgia law.
And we truly can't underscore this enough. The cycle of displacement, violence, and oppression for black families who fled in 1912 never stopped. Trying to force their stories into a narrative about a haunted Lake Lanier only dismisses those voices of black families and their descendants. Let's take Russell Strickland. He and his family were expelled from Forsyth County in 1912. He wasn't drowned when Lake Lanier was built in 1950. He was shot and killed by his friend in 1933.
He came home like usually, and usually when he comes home, he's sometimes drunk, so he just lays out on the porch. So this particular time, he did the same thing, but he was shot.
That after the break.
By the time the Corps of Engineers started construction of Lake Lanier in 1950, expelled black residents, like Russell Strickland, had established their lives in other communities.
Russell Strickland and his family fled Forsyth County in 1912. with his wife, Rosalie, and their children. They hoped for a better life after fleeing to Alpharetta, Georgia. But that wasn't the case. Russell's grandson, Charles Grogan.
Russell Strickland, my grandfather, was a tough guy. And he would drink a little, drink a lot. And usually when he comes home, he's sometimes drunk, so he just lays out on the porch. And around 1933, when he died, his death was because of a white gentleman that he worked for that owed him money. He went to retrieve the money, and the white guy wouldn't give him the money. So he got mad, and they got a fight with him. So on his way back home, the guy shot him. You know, he came home like usually and just sits on the porch, or lays on the porch. And so they thought he was just drinking. So the next morning when they got up, they found out he had been shot. And then they took him to the hospital, and I don't know if it was on the way, he died on the way, or he died at the hospital, but he died from that situation.
Russell Strickland was killed by Dewey Roper in September 1933, the same month where 21 years prior, Russell fled racial violence in Forsyth County. While Roper was initially arrested, there's no indication that he was ever convicted of murder. Instead, it was well known in Alpharetta that Dewey Roper had killed a black man and gotten away with it.
Keep in mind, this happened years before the dam and lake were built. Former Forsyth black residents like Russell Strickland never lived to see Lake Lanier. For others, a lake being built where they had been expelled from for decades was the last thing on their minds. Let's hear from Edith Lester again. Her family fled to Fulton County in 1912. She grew up in North Fulton. Still, it's a time when the school system is segregated.
We had to bypass all of the white schools to go to this little school on a dirt road down called Providence. And my brothers, they ended up going to Washington High, the only black high school they had in Atlanta. So everybody had to go to Washington High.
At that time, Booker T. Washington High School was the only high school for black children from North Fulton. Fulton County is huge, so if you lived in North Fulton, like Edith did, you had to travel nearly 30 miles to Atlanta just to get a high school education. And there were no school buses for black students, so they had to find their own transportation.
If you were lucky, you might have a family member like Guy Strickland. He was Edith's uncle. He bought a station wagon to take students from North Fulton to Washington High every day of the school week. Here's how Guy's daughter, Maisie, remembers it.
I had other cousins who wanted to go, so they sent their children down with us in the mornings. And it snowballed, whereas the whole community wanted their children to go. So we ended up with about 14 kids on that one station wagon. How we made it, God only knows. We passed about 4 white schools trying to get to Washington High. We passed Roswell High School, Sandy Springs. We experienced a lot of, problems with that, but we made it.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began.
Now let's get to the 1960s. Black descendants watched the world change during the civil rights movement. And those we interviewed were on the front lines. But the weight of what happened in 1912 never truly left. William David Strickland was an infant when his family fled Forsyth County. His grandfather, Jim Strickland, was forced to leave 80 acres of land.
His family found themselves stuck in a cycle of sharecropping. Jim's grandson, William, went on to become a pastor in Roswell, Georgia, where he started a family with a woman named Viola. They worked to build a better life than the one William had as a child. Then, in 1961, his wife, Viola, was arrested for a crime the family maintains she did not commit. Here is William and Viola's daughter, Willie Cook.
There was a lot of prejudice when we was growing up in Roswell when I was young. The Ku Klux Klan used to drive through our community, yelling things at us, blowing horns. And there were 2 policemen that were really prejudiced in Roswell. They were always just messing with black folk during that time. And one night, my mother and we were playing in the house. We came out in the yard. We were just being loud and everything. And my mama had a brush in her hand, but she really wasn't hitting me or nothing like that. We were just playing. And they drove up, and they stopped the car and got out, came up in the yard, and started harassing us. And one of them pulled a gun on me, stuck it in my head. I was 12 years old. They said my mama was beating me and all that, and they took her to jail. And we went to court. My mother went to jail for 14 months for something she didn't really do. And I will never forget that.
Viola fought the charges in court, and this became a landmark case in Georgia. Prior to her trial, Georgia law forbade defendants from making sworn statements and being cross-examined. By not being sworn in, statements made by defendants appeared less credible before a jury. Viola's lawyer successfully argued against this practice, and she became the first known defendant in Georgia's history to be sworn in and cross-examined.
Still, the jury found Viola guilty of mayhem, but they also believed she should only be charged with a misdemeanor. The presiding judge, Ernest E. Andrews, overruled their decision and convicted Viola of a felony. She would be sentenced to a year in prison.
1912 wasn't the beginning or end of racial trauma for former residents and their descendants. This trauma has only compounded over time. And when descendants have tried to preserve their family histories, they've struggled with being erased.
Take the Bagleys, who we met last episode. William and Ida Bagley were forced to leave their 60 acres in Forsyth County, but they still went on to establish Bagley Park, a predominantly black neighborhood in the Buckhead community of Atlanta.
By 1950, Fulton County had forced all of Bagley Park's residents to leave using eminent domain. They demolished the neighborhood and built a public park with baseball fields for the surrounding, largely white community.
According to William and Ida's daughter, Willie Mae, Fulton County agreed to name the new public park Bagley Park as a concession for demolishing the neighborhood. It remained Bagley Park for decades until 1980, when the name changed to Frankie Allen Park, who was a Little League baseball official. Willie Mae's daughter, Elon Osby.
In 1980, there was a Little League coach by the name of Frankie Allen. He was a coach for Buckhead baseball, or a referee, I believe. And he passed, and in honor of him, they decided that they wanted to name the park Frankie Allen. I was just driving through Buckhead one day and saw that the sign had been changed to Frankie Allen, and just driving down Far Road, and you see the sign, but you don't believe it. And so I went and turned around and came back and drove into the park and saw this. And so I went home and told my mother, and she was devastated. She really was. She wrote letters to officials in the city of Atlanta, also Fulton County, but it was already done, and so nothing could be done about it at that time.
Elon has a copy of one of the letters her mother, Willie Mae, wrote to Harold Sheets, a white lawyer from Fulton County. Here's an actor reading part of that letter.
I am one of the daughters of the late William Bagley, the original founder of Bagley Park. I am just heartbroken to hear that the name of Bagley Park is being changed in honor of someone we never heard of. My father had it rough. He, along with all blacks living in Cumming, Georgia, were forced to leave all they had. My parents left acres of farmland and didn't receive one dime for what they had. They came to Buckhead and later got 22 acres of ground and cut lots and street. We had to leave Bagley Park against our wishes. All we had to carry the Bagley name on was the park and the street. When we sold out, we were assured it would always be Bagley Park. Please don't let them take the sign down.
Willie Mae's letter never mentions Lake Lanier or Oscarville, and that's because neither are part of the Bagley's family history.
Yet people continue to believe the myth that Black residents were all from Oscarville and displaced to create Lake Lanier. Ultimately, the myths only make it harder for Black descendants to tell their stories.
It floods the story of William Bagley. It floods the story of the Stricklands. It drowns, in a sense, their identity. And it hovers over the bloodline as well.
Coming up after the break.
They're like, ooh, don't touch the water. You know, there's bodies under there. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I actually visited Lake Lanier a few years ago. And that's when I first heard the story of Oscarville as a Black town that was flooded. And that is why Lake Lanier is considered haunted. So while I was up there, they're like, ooh, don't touch the water. You know, there's bodies under there. And I was like, what? What do you mean? So that's kind of what I known the story of Oscarville to be.
That's Monica Goins. She's the researcher we heard from last episode at Clark Atlanta University. Now, her research into Forsyth County actually started as a closer look into the history of Oscarville.
Monica had been researching Black towns for years, so she figured Oscarville could add to the research she was already working on.
There's a problem, though. She could only find Oscarville being mentioned as a Black town in online forums or news articles. But she noticed that none cited any primary sources.
If you Google Black towns flooded, Oscarville's #1 in your Google search. So I'm just like, okay, news articles, that's cool, but I need a primary source. I need some proof other than just a journalist writing up an article. So as, you know, any advisor or college student knows, you need to gather up your sources, your primary sources, your secondary sources, just to back up everything that you're claiming. So I was like, okay, well, I need some census records.
And looking at those census records painted a very different picture of what Monica thought Oscarville was.
I'm looking at the Forsyth County map as reference and the different districts within the county that are listed on the census, and that it breaks it down by population and race. So I was just like, well, Oscarville's over here, but I was like, oh, the Black people are over in these southwestern areas of Forsyth County. And when I added up the number of the 1910 census, it was the number that everybody was claiming in these articles, like a little bit over 1,000 Black residents.
What Monica is referring to here is news organizations claiming 1,000 Black residents lived in Oscarville. But the census and a map of the district reveals this claim is simply not true.
There were 12 districts in Forsyth County in 1912. Records show more than 1,000 Black residents lived all across the county. Oscarville was located on the east side in a district called Newbridge. Only 37 Black residents lived in Newbridge. Of those, we can verify 10 residents in Oscarville who were Black.
No matter how the myth that Oscarville was a flooded Black town got started, we understand it's easy to believe. It's easy to believe because destroyed Black towns are a part of our nation's history.
We have lost Black towns due to white rage and white terrorism against Black independence. And so it sounds like a typical story. It sounds like a typical event. Like, oh, of course, you would raid a Black town and flood it for your own gain. That sounds familiar. That sounds like our experience. Again, that's why we have to look at the past. We have to look at the history as to why this story is being received. It's not that Black people are so gullible and we just believe everything that is being told to us on social media. No, this is a case that has happened in several places across the country. And that's why it just kind of creates this entanglement of misunderstanding.
This isn't about creating a gotcha moment. It's true that more than 1,000 Black residents were forced out of Forsyth County, but they weren't from a flooded Black town called Oscarville. The problem with this mythology is that it takes away from the families who are still affected by what happened in 1912.
The narrative is about the haunting. It's not about the victims. It's not about the racial expulsion. It's not about the displacement. It's not about the taking of land. It's not about the lynching. It's about this entertaining story of the haunting of a lake. So it's entertainment that's complicated by a true historical past of Black people just being removed, Black people being killed, Black people being silenced, pushed out, robbed, killed, lynched. Like, it carries that. And it just does us a disservice. Oscarville, that is such a minor detail compared to the atrocity that occurred in 1912.
And Monica is right. The mythology downplays just how huge this event was. Think about where you live right now. Imagine if 10% of the population was forced to leave in a matter of weeks. The lengths residents went to evict every Black family across 200 square miles were enormous. This wasn't a small white mob infiltrating a Black town. This was an organized effort to remove an entire population and keep it that way for decades.
Taking this real history and trying to connect it to the creation of Lake Lanier allows people to believe that Black history is buried under a lake, and it simply isn't.
Lake Lanier was the start of Forsyth County reaching a level of prosperity Black residents never got to experience. The lake opened the doors to development, construction of a major highway, and it was the turning point for becoming one of the wealthiest counties in the United States.
It was white families who had been living in the county since the early 1900s who were able to sell their farmland and enjoy the profits from what was now prime real estate. Black residents haven't even received so much as a formal apology from the county.
And in 1987, delegates from Forsyth, on a commission investigating the events of 1912, simply denied any Black-owned land was ever stolen.
The marchers were clearly outnumbered by their antagonists who lined the road in a scene that looked like something out of America's darker past.
There were Klansmen, there were people carrying nooses, they were throwing rocks and bottles, and they surrounded the marchers.
Next time on 1912.
1912 is a production of Atlanta History Center Originals. Christian Weatherspoon is our executive producer. Sophia Dodd and Samantha Young are our producers. Episodes were written and researched by Sophia Dodd. Our show is edited by Mike Voulgaris with Samantha Young and Michael Petrobon. Content support by Tiffany Hart. Additional support provided by Paula Shagnon, Atlanta History Center marketing team, and Atlanta History Center staff. Studio and field recording by Michael Petrobon and Linda Spears. Music is from Blue Dot Sessions and Epidemic Sound. A special thank you to descendants and participants of this podcast who shared their time and stories with us. Visit us in person at Atlanta History Center to see descendant photos and family histories, which are on display through 2025 and can also be seen on our website, atlantahistorycenter.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Atlanta History Center, and on YouTube at Atlanta History. 1912 is distributed by WABE. Listen at wabe.org/1912 or any place you find podcasts.